The sun had barely risen over the red mesas when cowboy Luke Carver rode down toward the San Pedro River, the morning quiet except for the soft creak of leather on his saddle and the steady breath of his Mustang, Dustfire, whose ears twitched at every rustle in the brush, and Luke, a man known across 3 counties for tracking outlaws and calming wild horses, felt something different in the air, a pull, a presence. As if the land itself was holding its breath, he followed the winding stretch of water, clear, shimmering like glass, and that was when he saw her, a lone Apache woman standing knee-deep in the river as she scrubbed a torn buckskin dress against a smooth stone, her long black hair spilling down her back like a waterfall of midnight, her slender shoulders trembling with exhaustion. And for a moment Luke froze, not because she was beautiful, not even because she was alone, but because she looked broken, hurt, like someone who had run for days without sleep, someone who carried stories in her eyes that could set whole towns on fire. And when she finally noticed him, her head snapped up, terror flashing across her face as she clutched the torn fabric against her chest, whispering in a trembling voice, "Don't hurt me, please," and Luke instantly lifted both hands away from his gun and his rope, speaking gently, "Ma'am, I ain't here to harm you," his voice thick with the kind of sincerity that made even wild horses calm down, and he slowly dismounted, making sure every movement was slow, careful, respectful, but the woman backed deeper into the water, her feet slipping on the stones as she kept her eyes fixed on him like a trapped deer ready to bolt, and Luke could now see the extent of her suffering. Her dress was ripped nearly from the shoulder down the side, shredded as if something had grabbed her, pulled her, tried to drag her away. Her arms were bruised, her lips swollen, and her breathing uneven. Someone had chased her. Someone cruel, someone who didn't care that she was a woman alone in a land filled with men who thought power came from violence, and Luke, with a slow exhale, said softly, "You're hurt, somebody did this," but she did not answer, instead clutching the ruined dress tighter, her voice faint as she whispered, "I escaped, they will come for me," and Luke felt his breath harden in his chest because he had heard these stories, rogue traders, bounty men, raiders who captured native women to sell across territory lines. And it made his blood turn to fire, and he stepped back to show he meant no harm, then knelt on the ground by the riverbank, speaking gently like he would to a scared mare, "You're safe with me, but you gotta tell me your name," and after a tense silence she spoke, barely audible, "Naeli," a name that meant "I love you" in her language, though Luke didn't know that yet. He only knew the sound of it made the morning wind pause, and as she struggled to wring out the shredded dress, Luke noticed her shivering, her ribs visible beneath her skin, and without thinking he removed his coat, long, warm, dust brown, and slid it toward her across the grass, saying, "Take it, please," and though she hesitated, fear still thick in her eyes, she finally reached out and grabbed it, pulling it around her body with a mix of relief and disbelief, as if it had been years since someone treated her like she mattered. Moments passed before she whispered, "Why help me? I am Apache, your people hate mine," and Luke shook his head slow and firm, meeting her gaze with a fire she couldn't look away from. "Not this man," he said, "not ever," and Naeli swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with a mixture of shock and gratitude, and Luke knew then, in the quiet hum of the river, that he would protect her, even if it meant drawing his gun against men twice as ruthless as anything he'd faced before. But as he stood and looked at the riverbank tracks, he noticed something else, hoofprints, fresh, deep, heading west, meaning the men who had chased her weren't far, and his jaw tightened as he scanned the horizon, saying, "Naeli, we gotta leave, now," but she staggered, weak from hunger and fear, and Luke, realizing she could barely stand, lifted her effortlessly into his arms, carrying her like something precious, placing her on his horse and climbing up behind her with careful, protective strength, whispering, "You're safe, long as I'm breathin'," but danger was already moving closer, the wind shifting with the smell of dust from approaching riders, and as Luke guided his horse into the thickets, he knew this was only the beginning of a journey that would test courage, trust, and the fragile bond forming between two souls who had no reason to believe in each other but every reason to hope. And as the river disappeared behind them, Naeli leaned weakly against him, whispering, "Why are you doing this?" And Luke looked down at her, his voice low and steady, "Because no woman deserves to be hunted, and because sometimes the good Lord puts someone in your path you're meant to protect." And though she did not answer, he felt her breath tremble against his chest, the first sign she was beginning to trust him, even as the thunder of hooves behind them warned that the men who wanted her were close, too close, and Luke, tightening his grip on the reins, muttered, "Hold on, Naeli. This ride's about to get dangerous," and Dustfire leapt forward as the chase began across the unforgiving plains, with Luke determined to shield the woman whose torn dress had told him her entire story before she even spoke a word, a woman who would forever change the road ahead. And as they vanished into the wild, the land whispered of destiny, danger, and the kind of courage that turns strangers into legends. Dustfire thundered across the rugged land as Luke Carver held Naeli close, feeling her ragged breath against his chest while the morning wind cut through the trees like a warning from the spirits of the desert, and though Luke's heart pounded with the weight of responsibility he had taken on without hesitation, he felt no fear, only determination, because the men chasing them were not just criminals, they were the kind who thrived on cruelty, and he could not allow a woman who had already endured so much to fall back into their hands. He glanced over his shoulder and saw dust clouds rising in the distance, meaning the riders were closing in, and when Naeli whispered faintly, "They are coming, the ones who tore my dress," Luke's jaw clenched with fury and he lowered his voice with the gentleness of a protector. "I won't let them touch you again, not as long as I live," and though she wanted to believe him, trauma clung to her like a shadow, but the way he held her, steady, unshaking, felt different from any man she had encountered before, so she rested her head weakly against him as if trusting him was the only choice she had left. They reached a rocky ridge overlooking a canyon, and Luke knew Dustfire couldn't outrun the raiders forever, so he steered the horse into a cluster of pines and dismounted, lifting Naeli down with careful hands, noticing how she winced from hidden injuries, bruises beneath her ribs, scratches on her arms, and he whispered, "I'll find us cover," before leading her into a narrow crevice formed by fallen boulders, a natural shelter from which he could defend her if necessary, and as he scanned the horizon he could sense the men spreading out, searching, hunting, and every instinct in him sharpened like a blade drawn in anger. Naeli, shivering under his coat, watched him with wide, uncertain eyes, but for the first time she saw something in his face she hadn't expected, fear not for himself, but for her, because Luke Carver, a cowboy known for surviving gunfights, storms, and outlaw ambushes, was now protecting something far more precious than his own life, and it humbled her in ways she couldn't speak. As the sound of hooves drew nearer, she tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "They will kill you, leave me here," but Luke shook his head slowly, fiercely, and said, "I'm a lot of things, Naeli, but I ain't a man who abandons someone who needs me," and with one gentle touch to her cheek he added, "Not now. Not ever," making her breath catch because no one had ever spoken to her with that kind of conviction, not in all the storms of her life. Then the raiders emerged, 3 men with cruel eyes, rough beards, and rifles slung across their saddles, and their leader, a scarred brute named Caro, shouted mockingly, "Carver, that Apache girl is ours, hand her over and we'll let you ride away alive." But Luke stepped out from the shelter with the calmness of a man who had already made peace with danger, positioning himself between them and the narrow entrance where Naeli hid, and he shouted back, "She ain't property, you won't lay a finger on her ever again," and Caro laughed, a cold, bitter sound that stung the air, "You don't know what she's worth, cowboy. Her tribe wants her back, and some folks up north want her for other reasons," implying things too dark to say aloud, making Luke's blood boil. Without warning, one of the raiders fired a shot that hit the rock beside Luke, scattering fragments across his arm, and Luke ducked, drew his gun, and fired back with deadly precision, dropping the shooter instantly. Dustfire rearing and whinnying behind him as echoes of gunfire rolled through the canyon like thunder, Naeli watched from the shadows, her breath shaking violently as memories of captivity clawed at her mind, but she refused to be helpless this time. She grabbed a fallen rock and held it with trembling hands, ready to fight for her freedom alongside the man who was risking everything for her. The clash lasted less than a minute but felt like an eternity, and when the dust finally settled, Luke stood over Caro, gun aimed at his chest, while Caro wheezed out, "She's nothing, just a runaway squaw, why die for her?" And something inside Luke snapped because he had seen Naeli's terror, her strength, her innocence, her will to survive, and he realized she was not nothing, she was a whole world someone had tried to destroy. And he said through clenched teeth, "Because she deserves to live free," before knocking Caro out cold. When the danger passed, Luke rushed back to Naeli, who was shaking so hard she could barely breathe, and he knelt beside her, gently pulling her into his arms, whispering, "It's over. I got you," and she buried her face in his chest, tears breaking free like rain after years of drought, tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed until now because she had never been safe enough to cry. But somehow this cowboy, this stranger, had given her a feeling she thought she'd never feel again, safety. After a while, when her breath steadied, Luke gave her water, tore a strip from his shirt, and wrapped her wounded arm, his hands careful, tender, and Naeli watched him with eyes full of wonder because kindness was foreign to her, unfamiliar, almost frightening, yet comforting like a warm fire after a cold night. As the sun lowered, painting the mountains in gold and crimson, Luke built a small fire and cooked the last of his trail food, offering her the larger portion, but she shook her head, saying weakly, "You have saved my life. I should not take your food," and Luke smiled softly, "Naeli, you're safe with me, you deserve to eat," and though her heart was still raw with fear, she whispered, "Why do you care so much?" And Luke looked at her, the bruises, the trembling, the bravery, and said, "Because someone has to," and in that moment something shifted between them, something gentle and powerful, as if the wind itself paused to witness it. Days later, After ensuring the raiders were gone for good, Luke brought Naeli to his ranch, a quiet stretch of land surrounded by cottonwoods and open sky, where she could heal without fear, and though she hesitated at first, unsure if she belonged in a cowboy's world, Luke reassured her, this land has room for anyone who needs peace, and slowly, she began to trust the quiet mornings, the soft neigh of horses, the warm meals Luke cooked for her, and each day her strength returned, her laughter appearing like sunlight breaking through clouds, and Luke found himself drawn to her gentle spirit, her resilience, her way of standing tall even after life tried to break her. One evening, as they watched the sunset, Naeli whispered, "You saved my life, but you also saved my heart," and Luke swallowed hard, because he felt the same, and though neither spoke the word love, the silence between them said everything, and so their story began, not with romance, not with promises, but with survival, courage, and the kind of kindness that turns strangers into destiny. And if you want to hear how their journey continues, how their bond grows stronger, how danger turns into devotion and fear turns into love, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because stories like this, full of courage and heart, are waiting for you there.